Got it. Okay, so we are going to move over to the panel discussion section of the afternoon. To start that process, we have two additional experts we've invited to join. And so maybe I'll ask Dr. Chartres and Gary Ruskin to first provide some initial comments on where their views are on these issues and comments on what they've heard so far. Nicholas Chartres is the Director of Science and Policy for the Program on Reproductive Health and the Environment, which monitors and analyzes federal, state, and local chemical policy, including EPA's implementation of the Toxic Substances Control Act. Gary Ruskin is the Executive Director and co-founder of the U.S. Right to Know, a nonprofit public interest investigative research group. So maybe Dr. Chartres, I'll ask you to go first.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the academies for inviting me to speak today and give my reflections on the excellent presentations of today's session. And also thank you to Dr. Lisa Barrow for her opening address. I think some of the safeguards the speakers have raised today are certainly important to protect research integrity and certainly a move in the right direction. One of the things that I think is important to discuss, and there's often a focus around conflicts of interest and their disclosure being critical in terms of maintaining research integrity. And I certainly agree in terms of being able to identify and quantify the level of potential influence. COI is necessary and the disclosure is necessary. However, it certainly doesn't safeguard the science from being protected from potential influence. I think Dr. Barrow mentioned today that research synthesis and systematic review is also critical, and how we conduct those methods for research integrity. And the reason is that it can also be misled, and in part because of industry influence in the original primary studies being synthesized. And so what I think is also important when we think about COI disclosure is how we then identify and quantify it when we're conducting systematic reviews that then inform guidelines or risk assessments that we may use to make recommendations to protect public health. I think if we don't have methods and approaches to identify conflicts of interest and industry sponsorship within those primary studies, and we don't attempt to quantify that level of influence, we may have an evidence base that can be skewed in favour of an industry's product if that's the focus of the evaluation of the evidence. I think it's also important to remember when we potentially attempt to identify and quantify the influence of conflicts of interest in primary studies, it certainly doesn't mean removing them. It just means considering them in our assessment. If we're looking at a body of evidence, looking to answer a question, there are certainly methods and approaches that we can use to quantify them and consider them in sensitivity analyses. So I think there are important things to consider when we talk about COI disclosure and then how we can use those COI disclosures to protect research integrity. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Gary, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. First, I want to thank the National Academies for inviting me to speak at this workshop, and thanks to Dan Greenbaum of the Health Effects Institute for his talk about whether public-private partnerships makes sense within the context of the auto industry. I work at U.S. Right to Know. Much of our research is focused on the food and chemical industries, and in the context of those industries, such a public-private partnership as the Health Effects Institute is a non-starter. We know from our own investigative research on corporate documents that Coca-Cola and the ultra-processed food industry have designed and executed an elaborate strategy to promote public-private partnerships as one part of their broader efforts to manage and control the public health discussion, to limit public policy options, to co-opt the public sector, and ultimately to defeat the public health community. So based on the evidence that we've uncovered regarding these hidden motives of the food and chemical industry, such a public-private partnership around food or chemical research on policy that's not likely to be good for public health. And thanks to Clive Green of AstraZeneca for his talk on their ethics program in drug research. It's nice to hear someone from the corporate world struggle in a real way with these real problems. and questions. And I think this sort of thing ought to be heartily encouraged. But at the same time, I think we should have zero illusions about the effectiveness of corporate self-regulation of research ethics, because it's not binding. There are no penalties for corporations for violating these ethics guidelines, their own internal ethics guidelines, and corporate codes of conduct can be weakened or abrogated at any moment. And that's why solutions to these health research ethics problems will come through federal and state law and policy and not corporate self-regulation. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we open the floor to questions, and please, if you do have any questions, send them over to our organizers. Patricia, Dan, Clive, did you have any further comments you want to make on anything you've heard?
The one thing thank you, and thanks, Gary. I do understand that some industries are different than other industries. In fact, we've been invited periodically to describe our model for other industries, and would they take it up to do something similar? And in some cases, that's been totally rejected because the industries did want more involvement in the discussion. The one group that's not here, and that I don't know how we, and maybe they're on other days, that I think is not unimportant, is the kind of scientific journal editorial community. One of the things that we have seen over and over again is that there's, and it's not just the journals themselves, there's this very, very strong incentive to only publish positive results. The journals want to do that. We actually had a prominent journal tell us that they didn't want to publish one of our investigators' work because it was the less interesting results. It was the negative results of that study. It was a very well done study. I think exactly what role they play and the sort of pressure to, and I have that question a little bit to Clive as well, in terms of how it decides, how the AstraZeneca, for example, decides what to do with negative results, and do you try and get those published, and can you succeed in getting those published? Because I think that's a very important part of what's balanced or not balanced in this, and it's something we've tried to look at very closely. Just make that comment.
Yeah, so maybe just to get back to Dan's comment there at the end. So yes, because there's transparency to all the results. Not every trial ends successfully from the perspective of the scientific goal that we would like it to, and so we share that as openly as we share the positive results. So I think across the research community more broadly, and thinking to my own areas of drug discovery, for example, then I think there is a dearth of negative results, and that will hinder perhaps some of the areas in the future around things like AI model development, for example. So yeah, I think the community was more susceptible to hearing about that. I think that would be helpful to have that information out there. To Gary's point on, Gary made the point on no penalties, and I absolutely see where that comes from. I think thinking to the specific aspects of policy and process, in terms of internal corporate policies and where they can end up, there are absolutely consequences for individuals as they go through that process, in terms of if allegations are substantiated. But I think that's probably a little bit different to maybe where Gary was coming from regarding the sort of corporate level penalty.
Lisa, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm just starting my video here. I actually wanted to respond. Thank you. I've really been enjoying this discussion and all these presentations. And I just wanted to respond to that point about editors and journals, because I'm actually a senior research integrity editor for Cochrane, and I've had a lot of editorial experience. So I'm speaking actually from an editor standpoint, but I'm actually going to refer to the evidence on this topic of submission versus publication bias, because there have been a number of studies done where people have looked at sort of the difference between what gets in the protocol and what gets published, or what's registered and what's published, and then interviewed investigators about what they're submitting or not. And the bottom line is that most of the bias of negative research not being published is related to the fact that it's not submitted, not that it's not published. So it's really a submission bias. And often in some of the interviews, that submission bias has come from reports which are more anecdotal about sponsor pressure not to submit studies. But I do think one of the reasons for this is that journals are very, very supportive of the publish of the raw data and data sets. And most medical journals are now requiring, as you probably know, publication of your data set in some open access forum. And what we have found is that even though that may even be available to peer reviewers, a lot of peer reviewers don't look at that. So it's actually still an obstacle, when you've got a scientific paper in front of you, to actually go to the raw data and think it's being represented accurately. And it's great that HEI will publish their analyses, but there's always more analyses or different ways of doing the analyses. And so what's published is still, what's not published, sorry, is still a concern. So I do think it's just important to realize that there's a submission bias involved there too. And I just want to bring people back to, publication is important, but it is the last step in that research cycle. So we really need to think about all the biases that can be introduced all along. Thank you.
Also potentially weighing in from the journal publishing community is the editor-in-chief of one of the leading medical journals, Rita Redberg.
Thanks. So I did want to follow up on, and I certainly agree with all the points that Lisa made. I think the sponsor can help play a role, as Lisa mentioned, in encouraging publication or allowing publication of all results, negative or positive, because like Lisa, I think certainly as a journal editor, we're interested in seeing studies that change practice, and negative results are just as important in changing practice and knowing what we shouldn't be doing or what doesn't work as positive results. Will put in a plug for my talk on Friday, because I will talk about all of those issues in a little more detail, kind of picking up from what were the discussions this morning. I think the data sharing is really important, as Lisa mentioned, but I personally, maybe we're reading different journals, often see the statement, because it's required to have a statement, but it's not required to share your data. And frustratingly, what I see is the statement is they're not sharing their data. And for example, one of my major interests in cardiology is looking at the adverse effects in general, because we talk a lot more about benefits than harms. And for example, that large body of statin trials is held at the Oxford cholesterol treatment trialists, and is held, they say it's an academic institution, but they're holding it for their industry sponsors. And in 20 years, they have never made those results available. And so all of the statements in the statin trial say they're not sharing, they can't share, it's industry data. And I think that is a big problem. So I think that we could, as a community, certainly the NIH leading the standard, but industry funds a lot of research, particularly in areas like cardiology, and we need to have similar policies for industry as we see at the NIH. It looks like Patricia's going to tell us more. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. It's interesting because with the new policy that's going into effect next month, now applicants are required to include a plan for data sharing. And now the good thing is that it's a term and condition of award. And so if the institution or the recipient does not share the data, then we can take administrative actions against the institution or on the grant. So that's a positive thing, I think. Really do, like, I am concerned. I know that I've heard this so many times about people making the statements in publications that that the data is available, but they don't share. We get complaints all the time about that, and I'm hoping that this requirement and that is a part of the terms and conditions of reward will help that.
One of the, you know, again, the topic of this particular conversation is protection of research integrity. And maybe I could ask Dan or Nicholas or you know, to comment on how trends in research sponsorship have changed over the years in your fields, and to what extent the current protections that exist are doing a good job keeping up with those trends, or you know, how that has how those you know, how those changes have stressed the systems that are in place to try to protect research integrity.
I see Tracy Woodruff's got a hand up. I don't know, Tracy, if you want to ask a question before I respond or not.
You respond first. I'll go after that.
Thanks, Tracy. I think it's, I mean, obviously, Dr. Barrow's presentation today looked at the historical empirical evidence in and around what we know in terms of the different areas of research and how it's been potentially influenced by industry sponsorship. And, you know, some of the research that she showed dated back to the late 1990s on secondhand smoke, then in the 2000s, early 2000s, in and around pharmaceutical drugs. And then she used some examples, obviously, in nutrition, you know, in the last decade that was some of the work that I was part of. So it's still relatively a new field in terms of the specific empirical data that we have on different areas of research. What I would say, though, is at UCSF, we have industry documents and a library that's shown since, you know, the early 1990s, the tobacco industry has been intentionally trying to undermine and suppress research in and around the harms of their products. And now that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, as more documents have become available for the industry documents, that those same strategies and approaches have been used across multiple industries. So I dare say that the empirical evidence will get greater and greater. In terms of safeguards, again, I think as a scientific and research community, I think we've been responsive to this as they've been, this information has been brought to light. I think it's still something that it's not widely understood across the academic community. I think that's why this workshop is so critical, to inform both the public but also researchers about the extent of the bias and how it impacts the decisions that are made from a public health perspective, and the decisions that are made to, inform healthcare decisions. So some of the safeguards that have been put in place at the moment, such as some journals having COI disclosure policies, are important moves in the right direction. I think journals such as the Cochrane journal is certainly a model that most journals could use, whereby the leading author can't have a conflict of interest, and there obviously can't be industry sponsorship of the study or the review that's being conducted. I think moves towards transparency databases are critical. We talked a lot about COI today, but obviously lack of disclosure across other areas of research beyond the ones that we've heard from today are certainly rife. We saw in the mid-2000s, the introduction of the Sunshine Act, the transparency database for pharmaceutical payments that were made to physicians, and I certainly see something that's been replicated for all research. Has been a really good model that we could certainly move towards. So while there are some safeguards being put in place, I think they're still inadequate based on the extent of what you've seen today from what industry is doing in terms of biasing the research process. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done.
I guess I also had suggested that Dan might have some comments on this as well, given that you've been in this field for so many years. But Tracy, did you want to jump in now, or did you want to jump in later?
No, I had a question on something else.
All right, great. Why don't we just hold that for a minute, and Dan?
Yeah, no. So first, well, admittedly, the sphere I'm most familiar with is the sphere relating to environmental health research, which cuts across a wide range of areas, but not the biomedical area, for example, or the pharmaceutical area. I think one of the things that we've seen is that the actual investment and funding available for environmental health research has not kept pace with even other health research going on. There's a general problem with that, I think. I understand that. But for example, if you look at US EPA, which used to put large amounts of money every year into environmental health research, they're not doing that same thing anymore. California, which also in the air pollution area was very big, is not doing as much. The European Union only recently has gone back into funding this. So I'm talking about the public agencies, and NIEHS tends to be the group within NIH that focuses on this, but they also tend to not get the same level of increases as other parts of NIH do. That's not a comment about, that's more the way Congress is operating and a variety of other factors. So what it does is it does open up the question of who's funding and who's supporting this research, the number of mechanisms. We're pretty unusual as a mechanism to take private funding and do it and apply it in a way that doesn't, that avoids some of the worst excesses of industry influence. But I think that does pose, because these are highly controversial areas, the chemical areas, the other areas, the chemical risk areas, which Gary mentioned, it does pose a challenge for the scientific community to continue to produce really high integrity, unbiased or impartial research in these areas. And I think that's something that will continue to be a challenge as long as the public investment in such research is so limited.
Great, thanks. Before we move on to Tracy, Lisa, did you have another point you wanted to raise on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick comment on, this spectrum of funding on a particular topic. That's really important. It's hard to get a handle on whether it has changed, but I can tell you, unless you do the meta research and really look across the topic and characterize the funders, it's hard to tell. So, for example, when we started doing research in nutrition, a lot of nutrition researchers told us, oh, the food industry is funding everything. You're not going to be able to do these kind of meta research studies. And actually, that wasn't true. The food industry is an important and influential funder, but it wasn't the major funder in the spaces we were looking at. On the other hand, with drugs, historically, and I'm sure you know this, Aaron, it's been hard to find out because sometimes funding for drug studies was reported under their marketing budget and not their R&D budget, because a lot of the studies were, studies that were really done for actual marketing purposes and not for regulatory purposes. And so you really need to dig into the company reports, and sometimes they're not transparent to find out. So I think it's an important question, but it's actually kind of hard to get a handle on these trend data.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, Tracy, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I just want to thank all the speakers. It's really been excellent. And I wanted to just pick up on what was said about the opportunity for public investment in research as a way to mitigate sponsorship influence. And NIH, Patricia, you talked a lot about the amount, and you have a lot of data available, including information about disclosures of funding. And it feels like NIH, that given the importance of research to the public's health, that NIH could be looking at investments in doing this kind of meta research topics that Lisa's talking about, because in some ways we could use better information to guide these topic areas. And I wanted to just follow up a little bit more on what Lisa's comment, because we often talk about disclosure as a really important mechanism for addressing sponsorship influence. But I think the research that Lisa presented showing that disclosure actually doesn't necessarily work, I think is a really illuminating finding as we're trying to look at ways to ensure the integrity of the science. So I wondered if you could respond to that, Patricia.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that, so we are involved in some public-private partnerships that that does come into effect. And then your question, I'm sorry, now I'm like in your original question. But I think, yeah, you're gonna have to remind me what your first.
Well, I was just saying, you have such rich information that you've been collecting, right? You have all these people that you funded. Some of them have private-public partnerships. You have a lot, people have to put in disclosures. So there's a way that NIH could evaluate the breadth of the portfolio that they've been funding and the issues about sponsorship influence, and could also do specific research investments, RFAs, around investigating this topic so that there could be more empirical evidence, like Lisa's presented, to understand the best ways to mitigate this challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, and I do agree. Yeah, definitely research on research. These meta-analyses are really important. And I do see that some of the ICs have started to do more of that funding. So that's a positive step. And around disclosures, it's interesting because, if someone's going to not disclose something, we're not going to know. And so most of the issues that we find are those non-disclosures. And, how do you find that? Especially in a lot of the cases we deal with with foreign interference involved non-disclosures, FCOI, funding, you name it. But again, it's very difficult to identify that information, but it is, you can't really rely on someone stating it.
Actually, this brings up a question that was brought up by the audience, intended for Dr. Green. The question is whether the experts that you employ are bound by non-disclosure agreements, or whether they can be vocal about instances when recommendations made by some of these committees were not followed. And I guess I would also ask maybe Gary, since you probably have worked with whistleblowers in your investigative reports, whether there are anything that you've learned from those interactions about how to encourage responsible whistleblowing and, working with investigative journalists like yourself.
Yeah. So I think on the one hand, that's where the process to raise concerns comes in, and the fact that there is an independent avenue for that to happen, so that it can stay, that by going to a third party to do that, that would be the avenue down which I guess we provide for people to raise that concern and to do it in a safe and a trusted environment. So yeah, I think that's that route is available to employees to do that. Yeah.
Great. Gary, did you have any thoughts on that, or is that not?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the life of a whistleblower is a very hard life. They're in general, there's the Ketam process, which can be somewhat friendly, but for the most part, being a whistleblower is a deeply, is a very difficult process for a person in their lives and their families' lives. And so, we need to do everything we can to make whistleblowing something that is accepted and supported in our health science culture. And so it would be great to have a president and a Congress and governors and state legislatures talk about these things and to enact legislation to help these very important people.
Great. So we've talked a lot about trust over the course of the afternoon. So I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to talk a bit about trust and public trust in this area, and are the various protections that are in place enough, like do they provide trustworthiness to the institutions? And if they do provide trustworthiness to the institutions, how do we communicate that to people so that people can understand what to trust and to know what information to have their to put trust into it? Because I think that too often in the current environment, from a consumer's point of view, it can be very hard to figure out what to trust and what not to trust.
I mean, I think that's one of the most important pieces is the public trust. We don't have that. We don't have people participating in clinical trials and whatnot. But I think, you know, it's a tough one, because then when you have you know, media, you know, you have the disinformation issue. I think, you know, I think a lot of it is going to come down to science education, making sure that people are aware of, you know, what type of research to trust when they can trust something. I think a lot of that is around education. I think that's a difficult question as far as, you know, how to, you know, steer people in the right direction, but it'd be interesting to hear others' thoughts.
I think we're courting a crisis of confidence in our health institutions, because they're so heavily rooted in an evidence base that may not be trustworthy, because so much of it may well be tainted by corporate influence. And some estimates are that nearly 60% of medical research, for example, is funded by industry, and much of that research, as Lisa Burrow just talked to, you know, about, is going to be biased towards product defense and overstating product benefits. And without a clean and uncorrupted evidence base, many people are just not going to trust or listen to scientific studies or public health leaders or medical institutions or regulatory agencies and other health bodies. And like, we're starting to see that already. You know, there was a Pew poll earlier this year that found that only 29% of American adults have a great deal of confidence in medical scientists to act in the best interests of the public. So if people think that health research really means corrupted, conflicted health research, then they're not going to trust it. And the power of science to improve public health won't be as great as it could be because of that lack of trust. And it's a tragedy.
Anybody else want to, on the panel, want to comment on this?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think Lisa covered a lot of this that would, and I guess when she summed up on things like open data, statistical analysis, there are components. All of these things are components of the decision making process and the results process, and so I think that transparency is, of course, critical to trust, and so I think in that regard, I think, you know, there's, you know, things like statistical analysis plans that get posted, you know, providing that transparency to that, making it, you know, easier if there are challenges to do that, I think is will need to be done, because I think one of the comments was around, you know, an increasing information and misinformation, and we need to manage that. And as scientists, where we're following the science, the defense of that is a scientific evidence based, and it is statistical analysis. So yeah, I think I would agree with Lisa's earlier comments around, you know, from what we can do with the experiments that we conduct ourselves.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is a huge question. I agree with Gary about trust. I mean, you know, we're in a crisis about trust in science altogether. But I mean, there's evidence on a couple of bits of this. I mean, there have been some surveys of mostly patients who are eligible for trials about whether they, how they feel about conflict of interest disclosure statements. And frankly, they don't matter to them. But that's not the general public, because these are folks who are actually looking to get into clinical trials. There has been some work on the general public that I don't think it's published yet, but I've seen some preliminary data. So it's a general public survey on conflicts of interest that will show that they couldn't really assess how it affected people because they didn't even understand the statements in the first place. And I'm sure as many of you have read these conflicts of interest statements, I can hardly make sense of them sometimes. You know, people throw in all sorts of extraneous things and it can be very confusing. So, you know, the bottom line is a disclosure is not going to really help us with the trust. And so we have to build people's trust in the science and the processes and the way it's in the way it's done. And so I think, as we've been saying all along, being transparent and also making it understandable to people is going to be the key. And that's one reason I'm a big fan of evidence synthesis. Cochrane has done a lot of research. People trust Cochrane reviews. They rate them very highly, and that's because there are experts who are vetting the information for them. And if they can trust those experts who are doing the evidence synthesis, then they'll trust the evidence more. And it's just kind of overwhelming to the average person to have to look at all the individual, bits of data on their own.
Great. Thanks so much. So, so we talked, a couple of people have mentioned different potential options for solutions here. And there's been discussion about self-regulation. There's been discussion about the need for government to step in or to try to be interested in this. Then folks have also talked about the role of the end users, the physicians or journals that are dealing with this material at the end of the process. As we kind of head towards the end of the hour and are thinking about wrapping up this session on protection of research integrity, I guess I'd like to hear from all the different panelists about where they think the best opportunities are for trying to promote research integrity overall. Where is the most sort of greatest opportunities for trying to address these issues on a not outside of your own institutions, but across the whole field?
So I think the single most important thing is that the message has to come from the top, from our president, from our Congress, from our governors, from our state legislatures. We have to tell the truth to the American people that our current health evidence base may well not be that reliable. And that as a matter of federal and state policy, we're going to do better. We're going to build a health evidence base that the people can trust and believe in. And that means one that's as free as possible from commercial influences, and especially that our regulatory decisions and policy must be based on clean and uncorrupted science. And we just have to do this. So many lives are at stake. We just can't allow corporate PR and product defense to pass as science anymore.
It's funny, I was going to have the same exact response with it as Gary had. It has to come from the top. When it comes to institutions in particular, not just the White House and the president, when we have integrity issues, we've discovered integrity issues, we go straight to the vice president of research at the institution, because they are the ones that can, set policy, helps to set policy for the institution. And they understand that NIH is serious, that we're serious. We're going to the top of the institution. And also, I think that, when we talk about responsible conduct of research training, that needs to happen also at the top levels as well. So a lot of times it's just targeted to trainees, but I think, to have more focus on those individuals at the top is very important.
Clive, Dan, Nicholas?
Yeah, I would just I don't disagree with that. I think that this is a larger systemic issue that has to have high profile. I would say that, for example, if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, the issue of data access and access to and paywalls and various other things would have been very different. But there were some very high level people who started talking about, including the Congress, who started talking about the importance of that. And we're, as we said earlier, we're not all the way there, but that's important. The one thing I would add, several of us use the word, I think we all use the word transparency multiple times. And that can be defined in lots of different ways. I do think the more transparent the funding and the method, the mechanisms for deciding on the research and overseeing the research are, the more public they are, that is likely to improve the sunshine principle will improve these questions. I think the challenge right now is that there are multiple challenges. One is of course that everybody can choose to define transparency in their own way, and there aren't regulatory, and we probably don't want regulatory definitions of transparency. But secondly, that's some parties, and this isn't taking anything away from Clive, but there are definitely companies that don't want to be as transparent about exactly who they have and what's on their panels and who's doing things, sometimes for business practices, sometimes because of how they're trying to operate in this space. And I think figuring out how to improve that transparency and make it much more consistently applied will be important.
Lisa, did you want to chime in?
Yep, thank you. I, of course, agree with all these points about transparency, but I mean, the low-hanging fruit to me is figuring out these structural mechanisms for ensuring independence of research from the sponsor. And, you know, transparency doesn't ensure independence. And so that's what we've heard about some models today, and I know we're going to hear a lot more about that on the third day, I believe it is. But I think that's what we really need to do. We need to make sure that the research is under the control throughout the entire research cycle by independent investigators and funders.
All right, great. Well, I think we're headed up towards the top of the hour, so I want to thank our panelists for joining us today and for the really interesting insights into the work that they're doing at their institutions to try to promote these goals and thoughts about ways that we can do this more broadly. So I really appreciate the contributions on this first day of this 3-day workshop, and hopefully we can follow up with everybody on the panel as well when we're done with this, to have them continue to be engaged in this process of moving this workshop forward, because I really think they had a lot of great insights and ideas based on their experiences that can contribute to this to the overall goals of the workshop. So thanks everybody very much, and thanks also to Lisa for her remarks earlier, and we will see everyone tomorrow.